I'm Liza from Imagine If Libraries, and I have another book to share with you today. This one is called Zora Me, and it's by Victoria Bond and T.R. Simon, a team of writers, and this book is available on Hoopla. So remember, Hoopla is a digital catalogue that you can use. You can access it with your library card, and you can download any of the books available. They're available right away. There's no holds, so if you like the sound of this book, you can get it today. You can download it to your device, so to a phone or a tablet or a laptop, and you can get reading. You don't have to wait for it. So this book, what's it about? What's it all about? Zora and Me. Well, it's a work of fiction, but it fictionalizes or reimagines the childhood of a really famous writer called Zora Neale Hurston. And she was an African-American writer, a Harlem Renaissance writer, if you've heard of that. So she was writing a while ago. So this book is set in the town where she grew up, a little town in Florida, and it's set at the turn of the 20th century, so about 120 years ago. So it's a historical fiction novel. So if you like historical fiction, this one might be for you. But it is also, as well as being historical fiction, it's also a mystery story with a puzzling murder. And what else? And secrets, lots of secrets and folklore, a bit of alligator wrestling, tall tales. It's kind of got everything. It's a pretty exciting story. So let's get started. Zora and Me. Oh, and it's also the first of a trilogy. So if you really like this book, you can get the other books too. There's two more about Zora. Chapter 1. It's funny how you can be in a story but not realize until the end that you were in one. Zora and I entered our story one Saturday, 2 weeks before the start of 4th grade. That Saturday, while our mamas were shopping, Zora and I were sitting under a big sweet gum tree across the road from Joe Clark's storefront, making sure we were in earshot of the chorus of men that perched on his porch. We sat under the tree, digging our feet into the rich dark soil, inviting worms to tickle us between the toes. We pretended to be talking and playing with the spiky monkey balls that had fallen from the sweet gum branches. But we were really listening to the menfolk's stories and salty comments and filing them away to talk about later on. That's when Sonny Wrapped strolled up in his Sunday suit, strutting like he owned the town and not just a pair of new pointy shoes, and calling for folks to come watch him whoop a gator. Sonny was a young welder from Sanford, who had come to Eatonville to court Maisie Allard. Eatonville is their town where they live. For 3 weekends straight, he'd been wooing her with sweet talk and wildflowers. When he wasn't with her, he was shooting his mouth off about how tough he was. That particular day, Sonny had managed to track down the king of gators. Alligators. The biggest and oldest one in Lake, Maitland, Sanford, or Eatonville. The gator's name was Ghost, and for good reason. One minute he was sunning on a mud bank or floating in the pond, his back exposed like a 20-foot-long banquet of rocks. The next minute he'd have disappeared, and the pond would be still as a wall. Anyway, Sonny got a couple dozen men to walk the short distance to Lake Hungerford to watch him wrestle the gator. Zora's father, her eldest brother Bob, and Joe Clark were among them. Nobody was thinking about the two of us, but we still had sense enough to lag behind and make ourselves invisible. Everyone stood a good ways back from the lake, close enough to see, but far enough to have time to scoot up a tree if Sonny lost control. Ghost lay still as death, but as Sonny approached, his eyes were like two slow-moving marbles. Before Sonny could jump Ghost from behind, the old gator swung his tail around and knocked Sonny off his feet. To this day, I can still see Joe Clark running towards Sonny, yelling, "Roll! Roll!" If Sonny could tumble out of reach of Ghost's jaws, he might have a chance. But Sonny was too stunned to get his mind around Ghost's cunning. He gaped, wide-eyed and mute, as the gator clamped down on his arm and dragged him into the water. People began to scream. I think I remember screaming myself. One thing I remember for sure is Zora, just standing watching, without a sound, tears streaming down her face. Joe Clark is a big man, but he hesitated for a second, a grown man paying respect to his fear, before diving into the water. 2 other brave men, Mr. Hurston and Bertram Edges, the blacksmith, dove in a moment later. It took the 3 of them to drag Sonny back on dry ground. I'll never know how. They were bruised like prize fighters. But they were better off than Sonny, whose arm had been mangled past all recognition. Back in our homes, we chewed on silence and thought about Dr. Pritchard, awake all night trying to patch up Sonny and make him right. The next morning, Joe Clark rode to all the churches in his capacity as town marshal and gave the pastors the news. Sonny didn't make it. For 2 weeks after that, you would see pairs of grim men with shotguns scouring the pond for a sign of ghost, but they found nothing. In the days that followed, Zora's father said it wasn't fitting to talk about what happened to Sonny in front of women and children. Even Joe Clark, who loved a story better than almost anyone, refused to talk about Sonny and Ghost. Sometimes, when I think back on that steamy afternoon, I can see my own father emerging soaking wet from Lake Hungerford. Sonny's broken body in his arms. But that was impossible, because my daddy had already been gone 6 months by then. And that's another reason I remember that summer so clear. It was the summer my mama gave up believing my daddy would come home. She had cried just about all a person can cry. As for Zora, while every kid in the schoolyard would talk of nothing else for days and pestered Zora and me for eyewitness reports, she quietly closed in on Sonny's death, like an oyster on a bit of sand. A week later, she had finally turned that bit of sand into a storied pearl. Because Zora is the storyteller. Chapter 2. I am not lying, Zora shot at Stella Brazel. Zora and me, and our friend Teddy, were facing Stella Brazel and her gang, Henny, Joanne, and Nella. They were jealous of the attention kids showered on me and Zora for having been right at the spot when Sonny met his fate. All 4 of these girls, Brazels, as we called them among ourselves, were daughters of professional men. A doctor, a dentist, a tailor, and an undertaker. This meant more to them than it did to us. To hear them talk, you would have thought that they were the duchesses and countesses and princesses of Eatonville. They carried themselves like every day was Easter. Nearly all the other girls would have liked to be them, and the older boys were always buzzing about them. And the more it happened, the more the Brazils were the focus of everyone. The more they believed they should be the focus of every eye. You too are lying, Stella snapped. You the lyingest girl in town. You so lying, even when you tell the truth, it comes out a lie. He turned into a half gator, Zora insisted, and I saw it. I was there. Recess had just started, and our whole class was gathered in a tight half circle before Zora. Stella hated sharing the spotlight with anyone, but especially with Zora. Stella Brazel crossed her arms and smirked. Where was this, Zora? Top of a magic beanstalk? Everyone laughed, except for Teddy and me. We exchanged a look, and then looked protectively at Zora. She didn't notice us. Her eyes were focused on her audience. I'm going to tell you all just how it happened from the very beginning, Zora said. Don't nobody want to hear your old lies? Stella Brazel barked. Ain't that right, y'all? Not a soul moved or uttered a word, not even the Brazils. Zora took that as her cue to begin. Everyone was eager for a story, and we all knew that nobody could tell a story better than Zora. I finished up my chores early last night so I could go out on the porch and catch fireflies over at the blue sink. She started. Fireflies are so thick there at night, you can just put out your arm and they'll land on it. You don't even have to try to catch them. I couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, and I'd already filled my jar when I heard a strange whistling sound. You could hear us holding our breath. It was so quiet. What kind of whistling? Ralph Hardiman asked. His eyebrows raised like clothespins were keeping them up. Strange sounding. Not like any bird or person I ever heard make, Zora said. But that wasn't the worst of it. The night started getting dark and misty, and the fireflies started disappearing. Soon I couldn't make out a thing in front of me until I got near Mr. Pendeer's house. Then what happened? Teddy and I asked in unison. I was surrounded by a white fog, but not thick like clouds, It was stringy, like spider webs. She suddenly waved her fingers at us like they were daddy longlegs, and half the circle jumped back, but nobody laughed. Then, as fast as it started, the spiderweb fog disappeared. I was flat on my belly in wet grass, right close up to Mr. Pendier's porch in the dark. I didn't even realize I'd gotten that close. I lay there for a long minute, still as a stone, trying to steady my eyes on the glowy light inside the house. Half a dozen voices. What did you see? The screen door swung open. Zora paused for effect. Out of the light stepped Mr. Pendier. But where his nose and mouth should have been, he had a long, flat gator snout. A gator snout! We all shouted, even Stella Brazel, in spite of herself. Zora nodded slowly. That's right, she said. Mr. Pendier looked like a gator man. Man body, gator head. That's his secret. And that's how come can't no gator kill him. One thing about gators that folks outside our parts don't usually know is that they make a loud hissing sound. Not all the time, only when one of their young is in trouble. It's a call to arms, and it sounds like a cross between birthing pains and dying pains. Mr. Pendier, a carpenter by trade, just like Zora's father, was fishing in Amherst Lake one time in a tiny dugout canoe that he'd built himself when he accidentally cornered a young gator. An older gator caught sight of this and started up that horrible hissing. Mr. Pendier, no fool, knew exactly what it meant. Next thing he knew, 3 grown gators, were in the water and swimming his way. But he didn't panic, not the way I heard it told. He let the gators get close to his boat, then threw the bucket full of fish he'd caught right at them. It distracted them just long enough for him to jump in the water and swim like the dickens to shore. The 3 gators smashed his boat to pieces, but Mr. Pendier lived to tell the tale, without a scratch on his peanut-coloured bald head. If any other man in town had survived the same experience, he would have crowed about it all over creation. Not Mr. Pendier. No one would have known about it at all if Joe Clark hadn't seen him carving a new canoe and asked him what happened to the old one. Everyone knew Mr. Pendier to be quiet and honest, and no one doubted his story for a minute. Still, some folks ran to the lake anyway and found the splintered pieces of the dugout canoe washed up on the shore. All of Eatonville looked at Mr. Pendier a little funny after that. So it didn't seem so far-fetched that Mr. Pendier could actually be what Zora said he was, half gator and half man. Well, then what happened? Stella Brazel snapped the question, angry at herself for being curious. What do you think? I jumped up and ran. But the whole way home, I could hear the creaking sound of a gator opening its jaws and clapping them shut. Teddy blinked. Did he follow you? He asked, nervous, like it had just occurred to him that Mr. Pendier might be gaining on Zora and the rest of us even now. Zora didn't have a chance to respond. Our teacher, Mr. Calhoun, stepped out on the stoop of the schoolhouse and rang the bell. The spell was broken. As we all ran inside, kids shouted things like, "Aw, fibber, you crazy, Zora," and "You ain't seen no such thing." "All right, don't believe me then," Zora said. "But when all y'all could have been playing kickball, you were standing round like boards listening to me. That alone is proof I'm telling the truth." And she beamed, as proud as if they'd given her a medal for bravery. The rest of the day, I paid maybe half attention to the lessons at best. Zora had cast a long shadow over my favourite swimming hole. There's a lot of places in and around Eatonville where you can have a swim, but Blue Sink, barely bigger around than a big house, but deep enough that it never dried up, was ours. At the deepest end, an old weeping willow dipped in the water like a braided head, and we would swing out on its strong vines before letting go at just the right instant. Those moments of flying in the air before the water swallowed us up in one cool gulp were pure joy, and I hated to think they were over. But I also couldn't stop thinking about what Zora had said. Just because something's good listening doesn't necessarily make it true. And Zora didn't have any trouble telling a fib or stretching a story for fun. I could tell that Zora herself believed the story, but the question was, did I? By the time 3 o'clock finally came, it was so hot that I convinced myself it was all foolishness. The three of us had been swimming at the Blue Sink since forever, and with the heat probably pressing up to 100 degrees, I was willing to take my chances. I just had to have a dip. That's the end of chapter 2. So, if you're hooked, if you like the sound of this, remember you can go with your library card, go to our website, imagineiflibraries.org, and click on our little Hoopla button and use your library card to check out Zora and Me today. All right.